I'm Tom Duggett, Senior Associate Professor in the Department of Literature and Director of this Romantic Horizon seminar series here at XJTLU. Just to begin with a little bit of housekeeping. So our format for these sessions is a 1-hour talk followed by 30 minutes for questions. When we come to the questions, can I ask guests to please use the raise hand function or use the chat function, and then we'll come and take your question. Can I ask everyone also to please keep microphones muted, but cameras preferably on throughout the talk. I'm delighted to welcome back to XJTLU today Professor Nicholas Roe of the University of St Andrews. I say welcome back because we're honoured at XJTLU to have had a long association with Nick, not only as a current honorary professor in the Department of Literature, but as a former external examiner and a plenary speaker at our Language Arts Colloquium way back in the distant mists of 2019. On a personal note, I'm doubly honoured to be introducing Nick today because I've known and been learning from him ever since I was an undergraduate at St Andrews way back, and at the risk of dating both of us, way back in the late 1990s. Poetry, said Keats, should be great and unobtrusive, a thing which enters into one's soul and does not startle it or amaze it with itself, but with its subject. That, if I may say so, is also the effect of Nick's example as a teacher and a scholar. Professor Nicholas Roe is the author of numerous critically acclaimed biographies and studies, including John Keats, A New Life, Fiery Heart, The First Life of Leigh Hunt, Wordsworth and Coleridge, The Radical Years, and John Keats and the Culture of Dissent. His two most recently published books are an edited collection, John Keats and the Medical Imagination, 2017, and a revised and updated second edition of his excellent Wordsworth and Coleridge, The Radical Years, published in the second edition in 2018. He's the chair of the Keats Foundation and the Wordsworth Conference Foundation, and his talk for us today is on Keats, Keats his father, and the London Cavalry. Nick.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening or this morning, and thank you to everyone who's come along to attend this talk. I'm going to be talking at the outset about Keats's father, Thomas Keats, and the new detail about him that has come to light, and then I'll go on to try and develop some of the implications of this in relation to Thomas's poet son, John Keats. So it's a talk that's in two halves, really, and if you don't hear much about John Keats in the first half, be patient because he does appear in the second half of the talk. Thomas Keats has long been an interest of mine, even though almost nothing is known about him. We have a few details about his appearance and his marriage and married life and his work at a city livery stable in London, to which I'm going to be coming back. We know a little bit about his involvement in a case of horse theft. The horse was stolen from him. It wasn't him who did the stealing. And notes about this case survive in the Old Bailey archive. And there are also newspaper reports of Thomas Keats's death in a riding accident in April of 1804. We have the verdict of the inquest, and this is what we have in this PowerPoint image. The inquest met about a week after the accident, and this was their verdict, a nasty accident that I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. Being riding on a certain horse, Thomas Keats accidentally, casually, and by misfortune, fell from the said horse down to and against the ground and received a mortal bruise in and upon his head. And quite literally, this is about all that is known. This is all that is known about Thomas Keats. Where he came from is uncertain. There are various theories. All that we really know is that he was employed in a livery stable in Moorfields on the City Road. So in view of this scanty information about John Keats's father, any additional details about him are potentially of some significance. And my talk is going to offer you one such detail and reflect on how it adds to our knowledge and understanding of John Keats's sense of himself as a person and as a poet, and his poetic calling. Most of what we know about Thomas Keats can be traced to a document called the Memoranda of the Keats Family, drawn up by the poet's publisher, that's John Taylor, in 1827, 6 years after the poet himself died. Taylor's memoranda was based on a conversation with Richard Abbey, about whom you're going to be hearing a little more. Richard Abbey was one of the guardians of the Keats children after their parents' early deaths. Abbey remembered that Thomas Keats was, as he said, a helper in John Jennings's livery stables at the Swan and Hoop in Moorfields in the City of London. And he remembered that Thomas Keats had the honour to be united to his master's daughter, that is John Jennings's daughter, Frances. And their marriage took place at St. George's in Hanover Square in October 1794. Now that detail is worth mentioning because St. George's in Hanover Square was a fashionable church in London's West End, at some distance from Moorfields and the local churches adjacent to the livery stable. Now this move across London to St. George's may reflect the couple's social ambitions, and we're going to return to this topic later on in Thomas's career and in the career of his poet son. But first, somewhat oddly, Abbey mentioned to John Taylor the danger of being alone with Miss Jennings, Frances Jennings that is, and Taylor was the first of many to speculate that there may have been more to say. I looked, Taylor tells us, to see if I could discern any of the lineaments of the young poet in his features. Certainly Abbey's disparaging account of Thomas Keats could suggest some kind of lasting resentment, and even perhaps that he had at one point hoped to marry Frances Jennings himself. According to Abbey, John Keats's father, this is image 3, which you have in front of you, John Keats's father did not possess or display any great accomplishments. Elevated perhaps in his notions by the sudden rise of his fortunes, he thought it became him to act somewhat more the man of consequence than he had been accustomed to do. But it was still in the way of his profession. He kept a remarkably fine horse for his own riding, and on Sundays would go out with others who prided themselves in the like distinction to Highgate, Highbury, or some other places of public entertainment for man and horse. At length one Sunday night he was returning with some of his jolly companions from a carouse at one of these places, riding very fast and most probably very much in liquor, when his horse leaped upon the pavement opposite the Methodist chapel in the City Road, and falling with him against the iron railings, so dreadfully crushed him that he died as they were carrying him home. Now, Robert Gittings, Keats's biographer, was not the first to point out that several of the details in Abbey's recollection can never be verified, and most likely weren't known as certainties to Abbey himself. Be that as it may, Abbey portrays Thomas Keats as a more or less young man who was conceited, who was extravagant, and who drank too much. Yet despite having no great accomplishments, Thomas had been successful, he was sociable, and he was popular with his companions. And it's worth noting that 3 decades after Thomas's death, Richard Abbey hadn't forgotten him. So to balance Abbey's disagreeable account of Thomas Keats, it's worth recalling what Keats's schoolfellow Charles Cowden Clarke had to say about him. He was one of the few people who actually remembered Keats's parents, because he had encountered them at the school in Enfield, kept by his father, and which Keats attended. His impression of Keats's father was that he was the principal servant at the Swan and Hoop stables, a man of so remarkably fine a common sense and native respectability that I perfectly remember the warm terms in which his demeanour used to be canvassed by my parents after he'd been to visit his boys, that is John, George and Tom Keats. He was short of stature and well knit in person. John Keats resembled him both in make and feature, with brown hair and dark hazel eyes. He was killed by a fall from his horse. So 2 strongly contrasting recollections of Thomas Keats here. And it's difficult to reconcile Abbey's carousing upstart, I suppose we could call him, with Clarke's memory of the poet's father. Sensible, respectable, dapper, one could say, and certainly a devoted father. Whereas Clarke's recollection presented a kind of carefully measured profile, Abbey's narrative of the rise and fall of Thomas Keats lingered over details of what would now be termed social mobility. Notably, the circumstance that Thomas had thought it became him to act somewhat more the man of consequence than he'd been accustomed to do, but it was still in the way of his profession. He kept a remarkably fine horse for his own riding. Well, in an era when horse ownership was a commonplace, hardly worth mentioning, Thomas's fine horse seems to have rankled because it embodied his elevation and also enabled him to act as a man of consequence. So we've got a kind of juxtaposition here between a helper in a livery stable, the principal servant at the Swan and Hoop, and the idea of Thomas as a man of consequence. That Thomas's horse leapt and falling with him crushed him may indicate that Abbey thought John Keats's father deserved such a downfall. But what exactly did Abbey mean when he claimed that Thomas appeared to act somewhat more the man of consequence than he had been accustomed to do, but it was still in the way of his profession? Well, this is a clue, I think. The phrase "in the way of" indicates that Thomas Keats's elevation had been related to his employment in the horse trade, if not directly so. Thomas continued as principal servant at the Swan and Hoop, taking over the business in 1802 when his father-in-law John Jennings retired. At this time, the City of London required anyone who kept a tavern or an inn or a livery stable in the city to be a freeman of the Innholders Company. Keats's grandfather, John Jennings, had been the master of the Innholders Company, one of the great guilds of the City of London. Accordingly, Thomas Keats now took steps to establish his right to operate the livery stable by becoming a freeman of the Innholders Company, preliminary to purchasing his freedom of the City of London. So you get a sense of how the servant at the Swan and Hoop is, as it were, rising through the ranks and becoming a prominent figure, arguably. And this is the note from the minutes of the Innholders Company that you can see in front of you, recording Thomas Keates being made free of the Innholders Company. He didn't actually gain his freedom of the City of London because his accident and death intervened, but he was on the way to that. Once legally permitted to trade, Thomas took the significant step of renaming his premises. So the Swan and Hoop became Keats's livery stables, and Thomas prospered there until his fatal accident on the night of Saturday the 14th of April, 1804. So this is the context. Abbey had good reason for remembering that Thomas Keats's marriage had enabled him to advance himself, becoming a freeman of the Innholders Company in the way of his profession. He was evidently an ambitious man, evidently very able as well, and might now be described in a modern cant phrase as an upwardly mobile achiever who had successfully turned circumstances to his advantage and moved up the social scale. Certainly Thomas was well known in London and beyond, and his violent death was widely reported. It appeared in the Times, in the London Courier, in the Evening Mail, in the Star, somewhat oddly in the Ipswich Journal, and in the Gentleman's Magazine. And these are the details. On Sunday, Mr. Keats, livery stable keeper in Moorfields, went to dine at Southgate. He returned at a late hour, and on passing down the City Road, his horse fell with him when he had the misfortune to fracture his skull. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning when the watchman found him. He was at that time alive but speechless. The watchman got assistance and took him to a house in the neighbourhood where he died about 8 o'clock. Thomas's funeral was held at St. Stephen's Church in Coleman Street on Monday the 23rd of April, and one might think that as he was lowered into the ground, that his story had come to an end. As John Keats was well aware, however, his father's funeral occurred on a date traditionally associated with Shakespeare's birthday, creating a link between his father's accident and death and his own ambitions as a poet under the guidance of his immortal presider, Shakespeare, who of course is also reputed to have died on the 23rd of April. One day after Thomas's funeral, a belated report of his accident was published in the Weekly Dispatch, and this account gives us some further significant details about him. And again, you've got this in front of you. Mr. Thomas Keats of Moorgate, a member of the London Volunteer Cavalry, was found early on Monday morning in the City Road with his skull dreadfully fractured. It is supposed that his horse had fallen with him. The horse was caught in Finsbury Square and by accident taken to Mr. Keats's own stables when his servant recognised the horse. Mr. Keats was then found near the artillery gates. He was conveyed home and died at 8 o'clock in the morning. He has left a wife and 5 children to lament his unfortunate death. So this is 3 weeks after Thomas's accident. And you can see several pieces of fresh information about him. Most obviously that he was a member of the loyal London Volunteer Cavalry. There are other details that place the location of the accident somewhere different, near the artillery gates, the gates to the artillery ground off the City Road, and the mistaken record that he had 5 children. Thomas and Frances did in fact have 5 children, but little Edward Keats had died in early childhood. Thomas's enlistment in the London Volunteer Cavalry helps make sense of Richard Abbey's anecdote about his fine horse for his own riding, and that on Sundays he would go out with others who prided themselves in the like distinction to Highgate, Highbury, or some other places of public entertainment. The city newspapers, if you do a search for volunteers and cavalry, the city newspapers frequently reported the London Volunteers, including the cavalry, training at Highgate and Highbury, where after a grand field day, they would retire to the Highbury Barn Tavern for refreshments. And we got some images here, Tom, of a London, this is the Moorfields locality. Can you go back to the map? The location of the Swan and Hoop, Keats's livery stable, is immediately adjacent to Bethlem Hospital, on the left there, right adjacent to the great madhouse, Bedlam. The Moorfields open spaces were where the volunteers would parade, and the artillery ground near which Thomas is supposed to have had his accident is top left. So this is all within a few hundred yards of each other, if you see what I mean. Now, if we go to the next one, Tom, this shows a member of the London Volunteer Cavalry in the uniform that Keats's father would have worn, executing somewhat terrifyingly, I think, the Austrian broadsword exercise. And you can see another cavalryman bottom left, and you might imagine that this is the scene at Highgate or Highbury, or indeed on Hampstead Heath, one Sunday when the volunteers were there to parade and practice. It seems likely, therefore, that on Sundays, Thomas participated in volunteer field day activities that concluded with a carouse. And newspapers observed that volunteers often came back drunk, and on one occasion there was a brawl amongst the volunteers that resulted in a fatality. Now, I mention all this because if Thomas Keats had been very much in liquor, as Richard Abbey remembered, he was by no means the only volunteer in that condition. So to move a little bit on from what Thomas was doing, I want to set out a perspective on what you could call the context of volunteering, in order that we can see when he might have enlisted. There were, as you would imagine, several phases. A first phase of volunteering dated from the 1790s, and as it were, fell into abeyance during the Peace of Amiens between 1802 to 1803. And then when war resumed with France in 1803, there was a great panic, and the Prime Minister, Henry Addington, sought a rapid reformation or recalling of the volunteer force that drew in thousands of what were called patriot sons of Britain. Among them, Leigh Hunt, who enlisted in the St. James's Volunteers, and William Wordsworth, who famously enlisted in the Ambleside Corps of Volunteers. It was at this period, too, that the London Volunteer Cavalry, consisting exclusively of gentlemen residing in or connected with the city, was raised. And this is the moment when I think Thomas Keats may have enlisted. It's possibly earlier, but this seems like the most probable moment. And by October of 1803, a full 10 regiments of volunteer cavalry had been formed. And in December of that year, a plan was mooted to consider of forming the quarters of Moorfields into one grand area for the use of the loyal London Volunteers. That's that open space directly in front of Keats's livery stables. So it's all going on in that locality. The summer of 1803 was the moment that the writer Mary Russell Mitford recalled as the great scarlet fever of England, when volunteering was the order of the day. The prevailing spirit fell in exactly with the national character, loyal, patriotic, sturdy and independent, very proud and a little vain, fond of excitement, and not indifferent to personal distinction. And I think if we go forward a bit, Tom, there are maybe a few more images of them parading. Here they are in Hyde Park in the month after the death of Keats's father, again giving you a sense of what these events look like, and again of the uniform of the Loyal London Cavalry. As you can see, it consisted of a blue coat with red facings and silver lace. The figure right in the middle of the image on the back of the black horse is a London Volunteer Cavalryman. Black riding boots and a crested helmet. Members of the London Volunteer Cavalry were described as respectable tradesmen, mechanics, stable keepers, and others who kept horses for work or pleasure. Conditions for enlistment were that men were expected to be of good character, accustomed to riding, and to have a fixed residence. As the keeper of a livery stable, Thomas Keates fitted this profile, and crucially, as a volunteer cavalryman, he would by convention have been treated as a gentleman. In 1795, the Duke of Portland, who was the Home Secretary at that time, had referred to the gentleman of the Volunteer Cavalry. And we're getting close here, I think, to the source of Richard Abbey's resentment. The volunteer system was recognised as a means of furthering middle-class social ambitions, giving authority, prominence and consequence to individuals who would otherwise have little public status or influence. When young Henry Hunt, not Leigh Hunt, Henry Hunt, a farmer, enlisted in the Wiltshire Volunteer Yeomanry Cavalry, he was said to bear the character of being one of the most powerful young men in the county, a reputation that some of his neighbours found irksome. When Henry Hunt left the cavalry after a disagreement with the colonel of the regiment, the Tory gentlemen of that part of the county were determined that Henry Hunt should be put down. As their words, he should be put down. Now remember Henry Hunt, because he's going to reappear in a moment. So to draw all of this together before we go on to John Keats, from marrying at the age of 21, in just 10 years, Keats's father had established himself sufficiently to join the volunteer cavalry. He was a loyalist and he was socially ambitious to the extent of having arrived on a level with Richard Abbey and John Jennings, who, as you've heard, were both prominent figures in the commercial world of London. In becoming a cavalryman, the principal servant at the Swan and Hoop stables had also acquired social cachet as a gentleman, to Richard Abbey's evident irritation. But how did Thomas's elevation in society, his accident and his death affect the life and the poems of his eldest son, John Keats? So we're about on time and just over halfway through the paper. There are a number of ways in which I think this bears upon Keats's sense of himself as a person and a poet. It explains, as John Barnard suggested, Keats's sense of himself as being what you could call socially a cut above the run of most people with whom he associated. And we know this from his fellow student at Guy's Hospital, Henry Stevens, who recalled Keats as gentlemanly in his manners, albeit with a good deal of pride and some conceit. He would walk and talk as one of the gods might be supposed to do when mingling with mortals. As a young man, Stevens had some ambitions as a poet, but when he ventured to show Keats some of his efforts at writing verse, he seemed to think it presumption in me to attempt to head along the same pathway as himself, at however humble a distance. Perhaps his father's social climbing helps to explain his eldest son's sense of being set apart as a poet who is destined to gain great things under the guidance of a good genius or presider. That Keats is reported as dressing as a young man to look like Lord Byron may have been more than an affectation, for he genuinely aspired to join what might be thought of as the aristocracy of English poets. So that sense of Keats's social standing now becomes perhaps a little more explicable. To go on with another detail from Keats's early childhood, an essential item of Thomas's uniform and equipment would have been a sabre. And Tom, we've got some images of a light cavalry sabre here, similar to the blades but brandished by Mr. John Goldham in that image of the Austrian broadsword exercise. This is the kind of weapon that Thomas would have had. And it helps to explain how, as a child, Keats managed to get hold of what Haydn described as a naked sword and swore nobody should go out by threatening them with it. It also explains why Edward Holmes, who knew Keats as a schoolboy, recalled that such was Keats's fondness for fighting, anyone might easily have fancied he would become great, but rather in some military capacity than in literature. So we're starting to get a sense of the military background to Keats's early life, starting to bear upon his decision to become a poet. And it's this thread that I want to develop in what follows. It's usually been understood that Keats was emulating his uncle, that is Francis Jennings's brother, Midgley John Jennings, who served at the Battle of Camperdown, the naval battle off the coast, I think, of Denmark. But we have a more likely role model in this respect, I think, much closer to home, his cavalryman father. Yet much as the London Volunteer Cavalry had enabled Thomas Keats to consolidate his social standing, his pugnacious eldest son would muster, as it were, as a poet. And we are told he did so explicitly. This is George Keats's words, the poet's brother. We're told that he did so specifically to exalt the family name. So there's a parallel I'm setting up here between what Thomas had done and what Keats would do as a poet. Keats's father had galloped out on a remarkably fine horse. His poet son would emulate the mythical horseman Bellerophon and be carried aloft by the winged horse Pegasus, described, of course, by John Longpriere in his classical dictionary as the favourite of the Muses. And here we have Minerva presenting Pegasus to Bellerophon, just to give you a visual image of what's in the background here. Unlike Bellerophon, however, whom Jupiter determined must be thrown down, and unlike his father Thomas, who fell with his horse, Keats was resolved to fix his eye on one horizon, poetic fame. Politically, Keats was no loyalist. Each traitorous lying bell, told to commemorate the restoration of Charles II, gave pain to what he described as his wounded ear. At the Isle of Wight in April 1817, Keats said he was disgusted by some extensive barracks, a nest of debauchery in so beautiful a place. And he hurried on to Carisbrooke, a village in the middle of the Isle of Wight, to commence his poetic romance Endymion, confident, as he said, that great things are to be gained by it. Now, I suggested in my Keats biography that the poet had deliberately travelled overnight to Southampton on his way to the Isle of Wight on the anniversary night of his father's death, that is the 14th of April, so as to make good that loss by beginning his ambitious poetic campaign on the following morning. Perhaps his phrase, "a nest of debauchery," reflects his awareness that a carouse with cavalry companions had cost Thomas Keates his life, as indeed we've heard Abbey later claimed. "I find cavalier days are gone by," Keats informed his publisher, John Taylor, in April of 1818, steeling himself for what he described as a life of application, study, and thought that he deemed necessary for his poetry. "I find that I can have no enjoyment in the world but continuing drinking of knowledge," he said. Well, the context of this remark was that having left all the trouble of Endymion to his publisher, as Keats said, that is, the trouble of seeing the book through the press, Keats now meant to reassure that he would be more focused and responsible from then on, a possibility that John Taylor's publishing partner James Hesse thought unlikely. That Keats was writing this letter to his publisher on the 24th of April, one day after the anniversary of his father's funeral, allows us to see how Keats might have associated cavalier days with memories of his father as a horseman, a gentleman, and a royalist whose cavalier lifestyle had ended so tragically. The only drinking now foreseen by John Keats the poet was at fountains of knowledge rather than the bar at the Highbury Barn, a pub that still exists, incidentally, in North London. That Keats was distancing cavalier days while enlisting memories of his father in his poetic ambitions may explain seemingly commonplace phrases such as "a spur to wind up my poem" and "a great spur to speed proof corrections." Also significant in this respect is his letter to his fiancée, Fanny Brawn, written from Winchester on Monday, the 16th of August, 1819. With no idle leisure, Keats tells Fanny, with no idle leisure, Keats tells Fanny that he feels, as he said, in complete cue, in the fever, and that he shall, in these 4 months, do an immense deal. He was indeed busy at this time, finishing Leigh and trying to get his play Otto the Great finished and sent off to London. "I am impelled, I am driven to it," he says. "I am no officer in yawning quarters," he continues. "I can no more use soothing words to you than if I were at this moment engaged in a charge of cavalry." Ironically, it might have been exactly at this moment, on Monday the 16th of August 1819, that a volunteer cavalry regiment charged into the crowd at St. Peter's Field, Manchester, the Peterloo massacre, of course, which took place on the sad 16th of August 1819. In a further strange coincidence, the crowd at St. Peter's Fields had gathered to listen to a speaker who was formerly of the Wiltshire Volunteer Cavalry, our old friend Henry Hunt, now nicknamed Orator Hunt. And you can see him in this image in the, I suppose you'd call them buff-coloured trousers in the middle of the tribune, waving his arm. He was, of course, the key speaker on that day. And as he looked on from the tribune or the stage, Henry Hunt would have been horribly aware of the damage that the Manchester and Salford Volunteer Cavalry was about to inflict. 1 month after that tragedy, into autumn, if we skip on through some other images of Peterloo, there's the famous one, I think is there one more? There's the sabre again, and we can go on to autumn. 1 month after the tragedy of Peterloo, into autumn, Keats would contemplate the spirit of the season, sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swathe. Now, that idea of a harvesting hook or a sickle has been linked to the saber-wielding imagery of some of those cartoons of Peterloo. But perhaps we can also say, maybe a little more specifically, that by laying aside the hook of his father's sabre, that is the sword Keats had wielded as a little boy, Keats has enabled us to hear the lyrical beauty of his poetry and all its twined flowers. So we're back with these, the idea of two choices for Keats's career, between the cavalryman and the poet that he became, a point that I want to develop a little bit further. Keats's letter to Fanny Brawne explicitly linked his poetical effort to complete what he called the last act of our tragedy, Otto the Great, to the immensely forceful momentum of a cavalry charge. His aim was to get the play performed with Edmund Kean in the leading role, establish a reputation as a playwright, and make money. I am exalted, that word again, I am exalted, he wrote to John Taylor, and look with hate and contempt upon the literary world. Sadly, Keats's words might all too readily be associated with the cavalryman at Peterloo, galloping on horseback into a crowd they evidently looked down upon as hateful and contemptible. And it's worth mentioning that the recent film of Peterloo is well worth looking at if you haven't done already, for its brilliant recreation of this terrible event. A drummer boy, Keats goes on to tell Taylor, a drummer boy who holds out his hand familiarly to a field marshal. That drummer boy with me is the good word and favour of the public. No doubt Taylor spotted the implication that in poetic terms, John Keats was measuring up to be a field marshal. Who would wish to be among the commonplace crowd of the little famous, who are each individually lost in a throng made up of themselves? Keats asks. I suspect that Keats's father had asked himself much the same question as he enlisted in the Volunteer Cavalry, thereby exalting himself above the throng as a gentleman, or as Abbey grudgingly said, a man of consequence. And we're turning towards the conclusion of the paper now, and I want to try and draw out some of the significance for this more specifically with some of Keats's poems. As we look back over this curious story at the poet's bicentenary, we can see that the day young John Keats grabbed a naked sword marked one beginning of his career as a writer. His father's advance in society apparently influenced John Keats's childish role playing with the sabre, dressing up like Lord Byron, and his subsequent decision to abandon medicine for poetry as a means to elevate himself above what he called the commonplace crowd. Leigh Hunt tells us that when Keats was in the final phase of his medical career, the idea for his poem "I Stood Tiptoe Upon a Little Hill" came to him as he stood beside the gate that leads from the Battery on Hampstead Heath into a field of Ken Wood. And I think this setting recorded by Hunt has some symbolic significance. The Battery on Hampstead Heath was, of course, a gun battery, a military emplacement. And the gate beside the gun battery might be thought of as marking a portal between Keats's possible career in the military and the path towards poetry that he had determined to take. As we've seen in the last few moments, ideas of the cavalry, of campaigns, and of military rank were repeatedly linked by Keats with his ambitions as a poet, and his stance before the public reflected a cavalryman's sense of social elevation, as was tragically demonstrated at Peterloo on the very day that Keats was comparing his intense creative energy to a cavalry charge. Ironically, too, the fact that his father never saw military action in earnest, as it were, may be registered in the figurative world of several of his poems. His early couplet poems, "Specimen of an Induction" and "Calidore," these are two attempts at narrative poetry that he published in his first collection in 1817. His early couplet poems are attempts to initiate what he called a tale of chivalry, a narrative poem that will relate how the young knight Calidore is lifted, significant word I think, from the world's bleak promontory for deeds of glory. Swords and sabres are laid aside, however, and Calidore seems to dwindle into converse, and finally the poem literally falls asleep. It's at least possible, I think, that the demise of cavalryman Thomas Keats may be linked to his son's poems of inertia and inactivity. Specimen of an Induction and Calidore I've already mentioned, but we might want also to think about Ode on Indolence, and perhaps even the loitering knight-at-arms in La Belle Dame sans Merci, with his pacing steed. Reflecting that his idea of achieving fame with Endymion seemed beyond his power of attainment, Keats said that he had once nearly consented to drop into a phaeton, that is, to abandon his poetic efforts for a comfortable and less demanding way of life. Yet he had rallied himself with the thought that "'tis a disgrace to fail even in a huge attempt." Perhaps in these last words we can detect a memory of his father's fall from his fine horse, a disgrace and a failure for a cavalryman, certainly, and also for an ambitious poet who faltered in a huge attempt. "If I fail, I shall die hard," John Keats announced to Fanny Brawne on the 16th of August, 1819, aware, no doubt, that to fail would be to fall, as his father had done, fatally distant from his destination. As we look back from 2022 at the strange cavalry charge of Keats's career and the many poems of genius that he felt himself impelled to create, we notice as well scenes of inactivity, indolence, loitering, drowsing, and slumber, rather than the Austrian broadsword exercise. We see how he surmounted tragedy and disease and poverty, and even the railings of the reviews that some would argue were responsible for his early death. I'm using the word railings there deliberately to recall his father's accident. The railings of reviews that some would argue were responsible for Keats's early death. I'm drawing to a conclusion now. He dealt with all of those setbacks in order to be ranked among the English poets. Rather than marshalled as the cavalryman, he could also have become. So you see, I hope, as I draw this to a conclusion, how a seemingly minor detail in a newspaper report can offer what I hope are new understandings of a poet who perhaps we all thought we knew well, but perhaps about whom we didn't know as much as perhaps that newspaper report in the Weekly Dispatch enables us to do now. And I'll pause there, stopping the talk and hoping that we can have a discussion about all this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much for that, that excellent, inspiring talk with an excellent and inspiring piece of scholarly detective work, as you reminded us at the end, moving from a small detail to start to understand, as you showed us how Keats's father's social mobility, as I think you called it, his sort of upward social mobility, comes to shadow Keats's career. You pointed out to us and reminded us that his poetry is often figured with military imagery, and showed us this stunning coincidence, again, as you called it, that on the very day of Peterloo, Keats is using this imagery of a cavalry charge. So thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. We have about half an hour for questions. Would anyone like to ask Nick a first question?
Have a silent half hour.
Maybe perhaps I can take chair's privilege and ask the first question. You just made me think, especially in your closing remarks, about generations particularly, and Keats emulating his father, but perhaps in a different key or a different tone in some way. So it just made me think of Hyperion and that more obvious contrast between two generations of gods, and kind of a clear contrast of military or sort of martial prowess and then beauty that's fated to excel. So it's not really a question. I just wanted to invite you to say a bit more about whether that reading possibly extends to Hyperion, and maybe also the revision to Hyperion as well.
I think it does, because, as you say, the action of Hyperion is an intergenerational struggle of a kind, isn't it? And I did suggest in my biography of Keats that in some respects we might think of Hyperion as a retelling of the downfall of what I called the House of Keats. And I think you could certainly make that the link that you are suggesting as a further way of perhaps underlining the extent to which Keats plots his life as a poet very much in relation to the events of April 1804, and it's striking the way in which the same dates keep coming up, 14th of April and the 23rd of April, at various points throughout Keats's career. There are various turning points or crises that gather around those dates. And one of the weirdest of all is is it a coincidence? The memoranda of the Keats family that John Taylor drew up following his discussion of the Keats family with Richard Abbey is dated the 23rd of April. So all this, what you could call a kind of hinterland of dates, can be gathered to that kind of reading of Hyperion that you are suggesting, perhaps. So yes, I think a couple of more sentences could have been added to draw in that poem as well.
Thanks very much, Nick. I can see Adeline has her hand up. Adeline.
Thanks. Thank you, Nick.
Hello,
Thank
Adeline.
you so much. Hello, Nick. It was a real pleasure to listen to, to hear about Keats for a good 45 minutes. Thank you so much for that fantastic piece of detective work, as Tom says. I wondered if I could invite you to say something about, the kind of shadow that Thomas Keats's absence would have cast on the life of Keats and the Keats family, because of course the mother dies when they're quite young as well, and
yes,
Richard Abbey, so Richard Abbey takes center stage as this kind of evil guardian, and there seems to be this battle between John Keats especially and Richard Abbey throughout his life, and it's really it's uncomfortable to hear that Abbey gets to have the last word with John Taylor and provide that history of the family, given the role he played in the Keats' life, in the Keats family life. So I wondered if you could say something. I guess maybe this is getting too far into psychoanalysis of John Keats and his place in the family, but he was the oldest, and he seems to have in his correspondence with his family, especially Fanny Keats, his sister, to have placed such emphasis on his role as protector and the oldest son. In battle with Abbey. And Abbey kind of, takes over as a kind of evil surrogate father. So I just wondered if some of that comes into it. John Keats, oldest, absent father, and then the cavalryman.
I think it does.
Sophistication of that.
Yes, I think there's certainly something in that, and to add to that, I'd want to put into play the fact that it's just after the anniversary of Thomas Keats's death in April 1818. As I said, Keats deliberately opted to take the overnight coach to Southampton on the anniversary night of his father's death, and within, I think, 48 hours is writing about Shakespeare as his presider, and there is a sense perhaps as well that the demise of Thomas Keats is directly linked to his choice of Shakespeare as a kind of poetic father figure who will enable him to pursue his career as a poet. I think there's certainly something in that. And just to return to his struggle with Richard Abbey, I think it's significant that when Taylor heard Abbey's account of Thomas Keats and his family in 1827, I think that is the decisive moment when John Taylor decides to abandon his projected memoir of Keats, because he actually says these are not materials that will do for a life of our poor friend. And I think that's the moment when he decides, I can't put this into the public domain, and therefore was unable to write about the poet's earliest years. So I think that is significant as well, the way this animosity between Abbey and the poet's father, and latterly between Abbey and John Keats, maybe arguably taking his father's place, in this relationship, how it plays out in those later years as well. So yes, I think there's definitely something in that. I mean, it may be. Abbey did his best, I suppose you could say. I mean, he was landed with looking after the 4 Keats children when Alice Jennings, the grandmother, died. I think the year was 1812. And thought he was doing his best for John Keats by signing him up with Thomas Hammond, the surgeon at Edmonton, for a career in medicine that could have made John Keats a very prosperous young man had he pursued that course of life. So one can understand perhaps Abbey's annoyance at Keats's decision to pursue life as a poet rather than the medical training he had so expensively and also successfully been applying himself at Guy's Hospital up to that point.
Thank you, and it just makes him out to be carry on being a kind of showy upstart like his father.
Yeah,
in Abbey's
well, exactly, yes, and as Henry Stevens seems to have perceived his behaviour as a medical student at Guy's Hospital, in that recollection that I quoted. I'd never noticed that before. It was only something that really started to make sense in the context of this wider sense of, well, that phrase again, social ambition, that started to emerge in considering the implications of what it meant to be a volunteer cavalryman. Now, having said that, I've spent hours trying to find the muster list for the London Volunteer Cavalry, and without success. There must have been one. It's not in the National Army Museum that I can detect, and I've been unable to locate any list of the volunteers of that regiment. So that is work, one could say, is still to be done. And the Weekly Dispatch report about Thomas Keats, that belated one that followed his funeral, was simply a chance find, looking at the newspaper archive to see if anything else had come to light about Thomas Keats. Unfortunately, in this instance, there was a significant new detail about him.
Okay, I think we have another question from Kelvin, Professor Kelvin Everest.
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
Fantastically good paper. Really enjoyed it. Learned so much. I was one observation and then one question, but the question you've slightly anticipated now. The observation is that business of dates coming round and round is very much the case with the Shelleys as well. They have what's been called a sacred calendar of so that they thought of the year as a journey through reliving when Shelley and Mary consummated their relationship, when Fanny Godwin killed herself, when Mary Wollstonecraft attempted suicide. They knew the dates of all these things, and it's almost like the kind of Christian year coming round. You know, it's the same sort of thing, and so maybe it's more of a period kind of habit of mind than one realizes.
Yes.
I was very struck by what you were saying about 14th and 23rd of April, but so that was the observation that maybe that dates were more important in that way than they tend to be for us. The other question you've answered really, but it's a very brilliant piece of work you're showcasing here, and I was just wondering if you could, for the sake of the people, the audience you've got here, if you say a little bit about your research method. I mean, even if it's a chance find, you must have been in the middle of a systematic trawl of some sort, and then there must be a considerable skill involved in once you make a chance find, developing its implications and sort of thickening up the the possible lines of argument that then become possible. Do you see what I mean? Could you just tell us a bit about how you do that?
Well, look, the thing with doing newspaper searches is, firstly, that what one might think are the obvious words don't necessarily turn up the material. You have to try words that may be adjacent to or related with what you're trying to find, because the hits, as we all know, that you get with this kind of search are effectively random. And there is a lot of material that is irrelevant. So, for example, if you're trying to find Keats, it will more often turn up Keating, which is completely irrelevant. The paper that I did on Keats attending to Mrs. Jane Hull, who had a pistol bullet shot into her neck by her husband. Mr. Keats of Guy's Hospital attended Mrs. Hull. We're told, again in a newspaper report of an inquest about this event. Searching this event using Keats won't turn it up. I found it by chance looking for material related to Guy's Hospital. So that's the kind of effect that I'm going that this has. What happened with the Volunteer Cavalry? I immediately thought of what Richard Abbey had said about the fine horse. That was the link that I made, and then to try and develop that from Richard Abbey's memoranda of the Keats family and see where it would lead. John Barnard immediately pointed out Keats's sense of what I suppose you'd call social superiority, which we have in that Henry Stevens recollection, and then the other details started to develop and fall into place. And as Tom was saying, one could bring in Hyperion in this context as well. Part of the I suppose you call it pleasure of doing this kind of work relates to what I said right at the outset, and that is almost nothing is known about this Thomas Keats, the father of the poet. Where he came from is not known. Who his forebears might have been and what that kind of background might have been like. Various places have been suggested as his native place. Thomas Hardy thought it was Dorset. Charles Brand, Keats's friend, thought it was Devon. Fanny Keats thought it was Land's End. None of these possible leads has proved to lead anywhere. I have started to think he must have been a Londoner. But again, there's no evidence to go on. Another intriguing possible lead is the fact that his death was reported in the Ipswich newspaper, which is which is kind of out of line with what one might expect. But again, I haven't been able to follow that up any further. But again, just to circle back to the starting point, the fact that his death was noted in 6 to 8 London newspapers says something about how visible he was and potentially how well known Thomas Keats of Keats's Livery Stables was felt to be at the time. So that's really the kind of, it's not really a method of research. But to come back to your point about the sacred calendar of dates of personal significance, Keats himself says, I think, that he had a terrible memory for dates, or words to that effect. It's clearly not the case at all. He seems to have had a tenacious recollection of the significance of particular days. And it's intriguing to hear that this also applies to the Shelleys, and possibly also to the Wordsworth family. Now one thinks about it. So it might be something that's worth exploring further.
Thanks.
So it's just one final word. So Keats was keeping these dates, or at least marking them. Fanny Keats, of course, had almost no recollection, she said, of her parents. George Keats said he had, I think, a slight recollection of his father as a figure with dark hair. But otherwise, all the parents of this family were very quickly almost lost to sight. George Keats didn't have much of a memory. Tom Keats died. Fanny Keats couldn't remember anything. John Keats, of course, died. So that by the time you get into the 1820s, the only people who really recollected them were Richard Abbey and Charles Cowden Clarke, who had encountered them at Enfield School. Richard Abbey died, I think, in 1832, so that it was only Charles Cowden Clarke who could recall the years at Enfield School and the parents. Unfortunately, did so in his important essay, Recollections of Keats, that he put into the Atlantic Monthly in 1861. Apart from that, and Abbey's memoranda, there's nothing else about those early years. That's enough. I'll stop now.
Okay. I can see there is a question, but it's not on the topic. It's about having a recording made available, which I think there certainly will be.
Is this recorded? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Does anyone else any other questions for Nick?
It's nearly snowing here.
Well, I could jump in with another one, Nick, if that's okay. I was just wondering, because you mentioned Charles Cowden Clarke and Clarke's, which takes us back to Clarke's school in Enfield, whether Thomas Keats's upward mobility, you don't really, you seem to use it but not want to use the word, but the phrase. Does that tell us anything about the choice to send the Keats boys to Clarke's school, which is an interesting choice? Yes. Gibbs obviously has such an effect on Keats.
Well, this is an interesting point, because there is a record that Francis Jennings had aspirations to send the boys at least to Byron's school at Harrow, one of the big public schools of the day, still is, of course. But that again gives you a sense of this kind of social ambition that I've been trying to evoke. The school at Enfield was a remarkable institution, supposed to be set up to educate boys, I suppose, who had ambitions to enter business. That seems to have been the ethos of the school, but it was also a remarkably progressive establishment, as we might now say, and as I tried to set out in the Culture of Dissent book, where I listed the various subjects that were offered there, very much in contrast to the classical based education you would have got at Eton or at Harrow. There were some remarkably modern subjects such as astronomy and optics, modern languages. They had an exiled French priest who was teaching French, and so on. What we now regard, I suppose, as a liberal education, and this arguably forms an important background in short, for the kind of poet that Keats became. There's no record of the library that there was there, but Clarke says he appeared to read every book that was on the school library shelf, and that he appeared to learn Lempriere's dictionary, and all of this was, as it were, equipping himself to be the poet that he became. So there is a sense that this was a school to which, I suppose you'd say, independent-minded and ambitious young people might be supposed to send their children, or at least the sons of the marriage.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I think we have one further question. So from Rosie Irving.
Hi, I was just wondering, going back to your methodology kind of commentary, because I am looking at newspapers myself, and I guess I come from a social sciences background, and I kind of got drilled into me about rigor. And how can you be sure that you're being rigorous? And I've come across newspaper articles, and it's kind of been like a lucky find sort of thing. And then coming to write that in my thesis, how do I know that I've been rigorous if it was a lucky find, and how is that justifiable?
Well, it's of course essential to be rigorous, and accurate in what you are trying to do, but very often literary research depends on chance, and I suppose being able to recognize what a particular detail might signify given what is known already is what I would say. When I started out on my PhD many years ago, what really got me underway was a chance find in some pamphlets in the library at Nuffield College in Oxford, where they have a collection of pamphlets dealing with political and religious reform. It's one of the best collections of that kind of material. And what I was doing at that stage, which of course was long before the arrival of the internet, was going through subscription lists, subscriptions for particular individuals, subscriptions to join societies, for example, or subscriptions to pay for publications. And one of these turned out to be the fees that was paid by an individual called Citizen Wordsworth to one of the divisions of the London Corresponding Society. And of course it immediately crossed my mind, could this possibly be William Wordsworth in London in 1795? And I became very excited about that, and it gave, as you imagine, it gave considerable momentum to what I thought I was doing at the time, until I discovered that it wasn't Citizen William Wordsworth; it was Citizen Henry Wordsworth, who had a London address. So that possibility was closed down. But nevertheless, it had led me into a field that I felt I could develop by showing how close William Wordsworth actually came to becoming someone like Citizen Wordsworth, who was a member of the Corresponding Society. So it is a matter of chance and good fortune to some extent, but also, developing what you find with the rigor that you're rightly drawing attention to.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, well, I mean, can I follow on with one sort of comment and question, sort of on the same kind of lines? I mean, so Kelvin mentioned this, and you very modestly said that there isn't a method or something. But I mean, I would say, in a way, what you're doing is the method. I mean, or at least it's the historical method.
Yeah.
What you were doing there with Citizen Wordsworth, in some ways, it's almost an advantage that the line of inquiry in some ways turns out to be to be a blind wild goose chase or something, because actually it's not. You're then creating the network, recreating the whole milieu into which then what you do find you introduce, and so that everything crystallizes, to sort of mix my metaphors. So my kind of question for you, actually, so the question based on that though is, so without that kind of, well, how do you develop that kind of hinterland, to use again the word that was used throughout today's talk? How can you get to develop that quickly if you don't, do you have any advice for how to get up to speed quickly with a whole period context, other than by spending endless hours in archives and libraries? I don't know if you have any other advice for those who are sort of trying to do the same sort of work.
Well, to some extent, the arrival of the internet makes this kind of approach, as it were, more accessible. I don't think it makes it easier. We can get online, we can dig into the Hathi Trust. You can work with in this case, the Keats archive at Harvard, or the Wordsworth Trust's excellent archive at the Jerwood Centre. As you say, I mean, the fact that Citizen Wordsworth did not turn out to be William Wordsworth was in a sense a piece of good fortune, because it set an approach to dealing, in this case, with Wordsworth in London, let's say, in 1795, and as in a subscription list, looking at the various individuals he was associating with at that time, which we know from Godwin's diary, which is also online, of course, now, and seeing what those individuals were doing and who they were associating with, so that very quickly I suppose our modern word is a network. You could identify a community of individuals, in this case in London in summer 1795, that allowed me to place William Wordsworth in the company of significant reformists and philosophical and religious thinkers who were there at that time as well. So that although there was no citizen before William Wordsworth, by implication there could well have been, and although not formally paid up as a member of the Corresponding Society, in 1795 he was almost identical in his alignment to John Thelwall, who was a reformist but had put a distance between himself and the Corresponding Society at this moment. So although William Wordsworth was not paying subscriptions, nor was the most prominent reformist speaker of the day, who was also a poet, and as you know, who also turned up at Nether Stowey in 1797 in the hope of making a community with the two poets, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So that's the kind of trajectory that was developing, and it was the word network is the one to hang on to, establishing who knew who, well, where they were and when, what company they were in, what they were publishing, what books did they subscribe to, and so on and so on. And gradually you can piece together a more complicated picture in that way. So the method is following associations, I think, such as it is.
I think it's the method, though. I mean, it's been a fascinating discussion. Can we?
Sorry, you did in your Gothic book, isn't it?
I was trying, but you know, that's why I'm asking further advice. Still, you know, trying to get some free advice.
Magna Carta in it's Salisbury Cathedral, isn't it? Is that right? Have I got that right?
Right, absolutely.
And locating the significance of that association with what Wordsworth was doing in Salisbury Plain.
Right.
You're brilliantly able to politicize that landscape. Don't you have a detail about at what point Wordsworth lost sight of the spire of Salisbury Cathedral?
Yes, exactly, something like that. But I would have never have started doing that kind of thing unless you showed me how to do it, Nick. So, you know,
it's a sort of a geopolitical reading.
Yes,
of that poem. I remember you writing
biography or something is the buzzword I was trying to use, something like that. Virtual representation, virtual topography.
Yes,
things around that. Anyway,
yeah.
Thank you very much, Nick. Can I invite everyone to show Nick our appreciation for his fantastic talk? A round of applause for Professor Nick Roe.
Well, thank you for listening.